Right, there we go. So we're going to have a non-technical presentation. It's going to be interesting.
Right.
And
So sorry about that, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me back again. No, it's. Do you remember what last time I was here? Would have been the beginning of a couple of years ago.
Over 2 years. Over 2 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So quite a lot has happened in the world of licensing. So I thought what I want to talk about is first of all why we actually need some sort of license, and then secondly how we go about licensing open hardware. And the thing that's most frequently forgotten is that we need a license because a license is permission to do what would otherwise be illegal. Okay, so if you're doing something that isn't illegal, you don't need a license. And it's a very basic point, and a lot of people, including lawyers, frequently forget this. So you're not breaking any laws by making a cake from a recipe. You're not infringing any intellectual property rights. So you don't need a license to do that. And that has some sort of ramifications, which I'll come on to in a moment. But that's the one thing that you need to remember throughout all these licensing pieces. There needs to be something that would be illegal in the first place before you can grant a license to make it legal. And that's where the whole idea of licensing comes from. So feel free to interrupt, by the way. I'm happy for this to be a sort of two-way session if I'm not explaining myself clearly enough. So the sort of things that might be illegal in the yes?
Sorry. The thing about making a cake from a recipe,
yes.
This is all to do with the fact that people have always made cakes from recipes, right? Because is there a difference in law between a recipe and a patent?
It's a list of instructions. That's
exactly. So a patent is a very specific monopoly that's been granted for a purpose, and if somehow you manage to get a patent over a cake, then if you were making the cake at home, that would be fine because of an exemption to personal creation of things that would infringe patent in the UK. But if you were making this patented cake in a factory, then you would find yourself in trouble. So the sort of things that might be illegal would be copying a design or manufacturing some sort of article from a design. And by design, I'm talking about something that's subject to an intellectual property right, like design right, of which we have 4 completely different and independent types of design right in the UK at the moment. It could be copyright that you're infringing. So that's the sort of thing that might be illegal, is copying that design. Could be manufacturing the article from the design, could be an illegal act. Copying one article to make another article, that might be an illegal act. And making an article which infringes a patent or a registered design, those could be illegal acts. So the issue here is these are all things that might be illegal. They're not necessarily illegal, they might be illegal. And the license that you're granting, it grants permission to do these things, to make the copy, to make the article to the design. But if you're giving a permission to do something that would otherwise be illegal, you can make it subject to a condition. So you're only allowed to make this article if, and then you can add conditions onto that. And the sort of types of condition that you would typically see in these sort of licenses, and they'd be hardware licenses, it's very similar to open source software licenses as well, are you can do this restricted act, you can copy this design, this article, whatever, if you retain some copyright notices and disclaimers. If you attribute the original author and designer. Now the interesting one, which if you're familiar with open source software is the copyleft, is the idea that you must release derivatives under the same license. So that's what's known as a copyleft or share-alike provision. So Creative Commons licenses have a share-alike option in there as well. In the flip side of that, the sort of license that's subject to very non-stringent conditions, so the sort of conditions that you just have to retain the copyright notices and disclaimers, are called permissive or academic licenses. And again, that's the sort of terminology that's generally come from the world of software. Now, I've been involved in a number of open hardware projects, and the projects that I've been involved with have actually tended to be pretty much on the really hard hardware, the mechanical side of things. So I've been involved in an open source car, River Simple 45s. I don't know if you've come across that, but that's a sort of hydrogen fuel cell based car. I've been involved in an open source drone as well, in the Open Relief project. Shane Cochran's project, and Andrew's been involved in that as well. And also there's a project called Protea, which is for an open source boat, which is actually quite similar to the Open Relief project in a lot of ways. And that's been developed by a chap called Cesar Harada. And we're looking at licenses for that. And what's interesting is when you're looking at an appropriate license for mechanical hardware, you actually have a number of different considerations than you would if you were looking at electronics. Electronics tend to be much more similar to software, so it's quite easy to get seduced by the idea that what's worked in the world of open source software is going to work in open source hardware. That's not necessarily the case as far as these sort of very hard bits of hardware, these mechanical bits of hardware are concerned. So, I suppose the question is, what's wrong with the existing licenses that are out there at the moment? You know, there's a number of licenses that already exist. Why don't we just use those? A lot of people use Creative Commons licenses, so Nanode obviously being an example of that, which is great for documentation. But it's only designed for documentation, so it does have a few problems when you translate that into the world of hardware.
So, sorry, what exactly is the Creative Commons license? I haven't really understood it.
Well, it's not a license, it's a whole suite of licenses.
Oh, right, okay.
So what they are is, they're really licenses that deal with things like documentation, visual arts, recorded sound. And they don't really distinguish between the idea of source and object, or instructions and materials. But they have a number of different options around them. So they go from being extremely liberal licenses that essentially allow you to do anything with the material that's licensed at all, to ones that are very restrictive. So it can be a very restrictive Creative Commons. So for example, it can have an attribution option, so if you use it you have to attribute the person who made it originally. It can have a non-commercial option, which means that you can't make any use of that design in a commercial context, and what the commercial context is a whole sort of fun area of debate all by itself. And you can have a share-alike option, which means that any derivative works that you make from that particular design also have to be licensed under the same Creative Commons license. And then there's a whole bunch of other exciting stuff. There's different licenses for different jurisdictions. So technically, there's probably 100 or so different Creative Commons licenses. But you know, they will admit that there are restrictions. They're not very good for software for the simple reason that there isn't the distinction between source and object. And they're not necessarily good for hardware, again, because there isn't a distinction between the design and the object that you're manufacturing. Some people try to use licenses like the GPL or the LGPL for hardware, and that doesn't work particularly well because it uses the idea of a derivative work, and we really don't know what a derivative work is for hardware. It's something that has a very specific meaning in terms of copyright. You know, the courts are quite well equipped to deal with the idea of what happens if you take a piece of software and you modify it, and whether that's a derivative work or not. It's much more difficult to do that as far as hardware is concerned. So to use an example, I mean, if we're talking about some mechanical assembly like a wheel bearing, and then we connect that wheel bearing to a stub axle, then do the stub axle and the wheel bearing together, do they constitute some sort of derivative work of the wheel bearing if you produce a design based on that? And the law just doesn't have the mechanisms to deal with that.
Andrew, does that mean that therefore you can't really do a viral license like a GPL in hardware?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go into a bit more detail as to why I've got some problems with that. And then, of course, you have a license like the Apache license, which, again, if you're familiar with open source software licenses, is a very permissive license, and really lets you do anything at all. And that actually works sort of reasonably well for hardware. Sorry, a couple of questions at the back.
I'm going to give it a couple of minutes. But what comprises of registered design? Is it just documentation about it, or is it the thing itself, or is it the method used to produce the thing?
Right, there are two different sorts of registered design, and there's a sort of UK registered designer and there's a community registered design. Basically what they protect is sort of shape and configuration. And you have to go through a process of registering them with the Intellectual Property Office, and they have a sort of relatively small period. But they're subject to what's known as the must fit and must match exception, which means that if you have something physical that you have registered design and it needs to fit into something else, so for example sort of to make spare parts work, then there's an exception that means that to create a spare part, even though it might otherwise be infringing the design, you've got a sort of an overriding right to repair things. So it's, I mean, the whole sort of design area is very, very messy. There's 4 completely independent sorts of design existing simultaneously in English law at the moment, and it's really, really sort
Does
of
nationality
poor
come
situation.
into this? Because, for instance,
Yes.
I was going to say, because I made the design patent of this, it was
Yes.
stolen by the military, but they never used it.
Right.
And basically, it was something very useful for scuba divers.
Yes.
It was an underwater communication system.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I wanted it to go out. My condition was that anyone could use it.
Yes.
But at the time, the military confiscated it.
Yeah.
It really said anything. It's frozen. This was about 20 odd years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if I was to issue it as a common license or community license, does that bypass the fact that the national...
Well, that's a really interesting question, because I've always thought that's a particularly stupid piece of what is already a particularly stupid piece of legislation, which is, it's a real disincentive to inventing things and trying to get patents for them. And, there's a million and one reasons why patents might not be a good idea, but that's yet another reason, is the fact that there is this specific provision which you've fallen foul of in the Patent Act that says that if an examiner has a look and thinks, oh, this could be interesting, we could use this for national security purposes, then all of a sudden it gets pinched by the armed forces. Essentially, you're out of your invention. Whereas, if you never patent anything at all, then obviously that can't happen. Yes, sorry.
Just as a minor point to add to what you were just saying, that's only for the UK.
Yes.
If you're on the continent and if you're on the America, they'll register your patent, but your military will be your primary customer.
Yeah.
They will buy, so they will be the only people that you will have to license it to. However, it's especially if it's the American Department of Defence, and they'll license millions. So you wouldn't have to worry about that one. The other, right, that's for one thing. The idea with the a wheel bearing and a stub axle is the fact that you've got a wheel bearing and a stub axle. The fact that the wheel bearing exists in and of itself, would that not be covered by first sale doctrine?
I'm sorry, couldn't hear the last bit of that?
Will that not be covered by first sale doctrine?
Still didn't hear it, sorry.
First sale doctrine.
Oh, first sale doctrine.
Yeah.
Okay, right, the first sale doctrine is sort of something that's sort of a uniquely US thing, but it's actually quite similar to the idea of exhaustion of rights in the UK and Europe.
Yeah.
It's not really applicable to this, because what I'm talking about is whether you can use how the derivative, because things like the GPL use the idea of the concept of derivative works.
Yeah.
So whether they can say that if you could attach this thing to a stub axle and then distribute it on, whether that means that you have to provide the whole of the blueprint for the stub axle and the wheel bearing assembly. So the exhaustion of rights means that once you've placed a specific item, so it could be, it's easy to understand the concept of software. Once you've introduced a specific piece of software on and it normally has to be on a physical carrier, but they're just, it's the easiest way to understand it's like a CD. That means that you can no longer exercise any rights over that particular CD once you've sold it into the European Union. So yeah, I can sort of see that there's a sort of connection there, but actually it's not strictly relevant in this case. Okay.
You need to watch the time with long questions.
Yeah, sure, sure. So what we've come down to is really, there seem to be, as far as hardware is concerned, there seem to be sort of three main licenses that are sort of gaining some degree of acceptance. If you want to put a permissive license, which basically means that you're allowing people to do what the hell they want with the design as long as they give you attribution, then the best one to use is the SolderPad license, which is a hacked version of the Apache license, which Andrew is hosting on the SolderPad website at the moment. So it's a very straightforward license. That basically means that the designs can be used for anything. There is no viral, copyleft, share-alike requirement without whatever you want to call it. So there's no reason why somebody can't come along, take those designs, incorporate them into a proprietary piece of kit and sell it. You know, the Apache license lets you do that, and the SolderPad license lets you do that as well. The other one that I've been working on is the CERN Open Hardware license, and that tries to be a copyleft license. And I've do have some problems how effective copyleft is in the context of hardware, and I hope to explain that to people later in the pub. But I haven't got time to do that now. But there's sort of 3 or 4 reasons why I'm a bit sceptical about that. But I think what we've tried to do is, as much as we can, we've created a copyleft license that works, and it works on the basis of a little hack that I came up with, which is it's centred on a license around documentation. And the idea is if you obtain a piece of documentation under the CERN Open Hardware license, then basically anything you do based on that documentation is going to involve you copying it somehow. You know, in the modern world, it's going to come in on a computer. You're going to want to you're going to want to copy those designs. You're going to want to change them somehow, and we give you a license that lets you do that. And that's something that you need a license under copyright to do. Making adaptations is something that you need a license under copyright to do. And that immediately triggers an obligation to publish any changes that you make to that design. Now you'll immediately see the flaw of that is that it really makes the license very onerous, because you can't sort of tinker with stuff at home without having to publish the changes that you make. Every little change that you make, you're under an obligation to publish it. The way that we've dealt with that is by saying that we're not going to enforce any of those obligations until you release an item made to those designs or the change to those designs to the public. And as soon as you do that, your obligation to publish those the changes to the design that you've made, they will arise. So I think there are ways of getting around that, but I think that's probably the best way that we can think of trying to make some sort of copyleft stick. Because the problem is, if I make a piece of hardware and I just distribute it to you, that's not illegal. So that doesn't trigger any intellectual property right issues. Whereas if I'm distributing software which is subject to copyright, that does create intellectual property right issues. So in order to make the conditions that I was talking about earlier stick, there has to be some sort of illegal thing that I'm giving you permission to do and make it subject to conditions. Which is, and I'm sorry, this is incredibly technical and very, very legalistic. But what we're doing is we're concentrating on the thing that we know that is likely to be a breach of an intellectual property right, which is altering the design in the first place, and then saying that we're not going to stop you from doing that. But as soon as you release anything to the public, then we will stop you from. We will say that you have been infringing unless you make those designs available. It's horribly complicated. Sorry, I can't think of any simpler way to explain it. Yeah.
No, that's good. You started off there talking about how it's all going to come under some sort of, will be classified as documentation.
Yeah.
Is that how you're getting around whatever it is that's stopping you pursuing people if they do distribute a bit of hardware?
Yes. I mean, the thing about software is virtually everything you do with software is going to involve some sort of copying. So there's the opportunities for copyright to infringe, which his name suggests is involved with restricting copying. There's, every stage. You run a piece of software, you need to copy it. You download a piece of software, you need to copy it. Every single time there is copying going on. And as a result, the Copyright Act has an opportunity to impinge, which means that you then have an opportunity to attach a license to it with conditions. With hardware, if I make a hammer and I hand you the hammer, and then you hand a hammer to somebody else, and this hammer goes around the room. There's no copying going on. It's an entirely different thing. So there's no opportunity for intellectual property to infringe, which is the fundamental problem with making copyleft work in terms of hardware. So I think this is probably the closest, by concentrating on documentation, I think that's the closest that we can get.
So are you saying that the design source is documentation, basically?
Yeah, exactly. And by documentation, I'm including sort of net lists and design files and CAD files and whatever you want to call them. They could be documentation in an electronic form, but it has to be something that copyright exists in for the whole thing to work. And the third license, which is called a strong copyleft license, but I'm sort of I'm fairly reluctant to use that term, but that's I wouldn't recommend using that at the moment. It's really predicated on there being, if there's something patentable in the design that you're licensing, then it will work. But there's not always going to be the case for something patented. We're working with John Ackerman, who's the guy that drafted that, to try to sort of tackle that specific problem. So I think if you're looking for a license, if you want something permissive, I would go for the solder pad license at the moment. If you want something that tries to have some sort of share-alike to it, then I'd take a look at the CERN OHL. But there is, we're working on a new version that's actually simpler than the current version currently. So the 1.2 draft is the one that we're talking about, and there were a few provisions in there we're getting rid of. There was a provision in there that required people to report back any changes that they'd made back to the original project, and we just decided that was too onerous, so we've got rid of that.
So can I just quickly ask what they're applying CERN to? Is it RTL? Is it PCBs? Is it?
They've got it. It's mainly electronic devices, so some PCBs, but. In theory, it could be applicable to any sort of hardware, really. It's got a specific carve-out. If it contains software, the software just gets licensed under whatever software license you want, so it could be GPL or BSD or Apache or whatever. Solder pad, we've got a number of projects considering.
Andrew,
yeah, sure.
if I do a design in VHDL,
yes,
I might consider that software if I'm using to build a simulator, or hardware if I'm using it to build a
yeah, and there's a real problem there. And the thing is, using the solder pad license cuts through all of this, but it doesn't have any copyleft in it. So if you want copyleft, you're always going to have some problems, unfortunately. If you don't want copyleft, then you can cut through all of this and use the solder pad license, which works perfectly well for software as it does for hardware. Yeah.
You said solder pad license is based on Apache license.
Yes.
But Apache license is much more recognized than solder pad license.
Yes.
I want to know if there is any. What is the one or two reasons to choose solder pad over
That's a very good
Apache
question.
license?
Yeah.
Because the lawyers, if it's a company wanting to use, the lawyers will have to look through the solder pad, whereas with Apache they know already.
Yeah. Okay, very good question. The first thing is, if you choose solder pad license, you can choose Apache anyway. Because it is contained within the license itself. It says if you don't like the changes that we've made, ignore them, and you can just use Apache. Okay. Apache is actually fairly good for hardware. It's not perfect because it only talks about copyright, trademarks, and patents, and doesn't talk about things like design rights. It doesn't talk about database rights. So we've sort of expanded it so that it does cover all those IPRs as well. But there's a strong argument from a legal point of view to say even if you don't mention them, the license is implied, so don't worry about it too much. And the other point is that some of the terminology between sort of source code and object code doesn't work particularly well to designs. So we've tweaked that a little bit to deal with hardware. But to be honest, I mean Apache was sort of 99% of the way there anyway. And if you look at it, you'll see we made very few changes to it. We're also looking at a permissive version of CERN, which would have a similar effect of a solder pad license. It's just for people who are used to using a CERN project, and they're used to using the CERN license, and they want to have something that's more liberal, then they can use that one. And we are talking about a new version of TAPA, which deals with these issues that I mentioned about patents. So the politics is, so I'm sort of involved in all three of these projects, and the nice thing is that all of the people involved are actually getting on pretty well with each other, so there's a nice contrast between that and open source software licensing. So the people involved are John Ackerman's the guy who is behind the Tapper license, and I say he's looking at redrafting that. Miriam Maas and Javier Serrano are the people at CERN who have been sort of doing most of the heavy lifting on the CERN open hardware license. The solder pad license, I mean, that's mainly me, but if you look at it, you'll see that I've only changed about sort of 20 words or so, but I've had sort of really useful input from people like Andrew, for example, so that's sort of been pretty helpful. So, I mean, basically I want this problem to go away. You know, I want us, the end process is I want us to end up with 3 licenses, you know, one of which is a really permissive license, one of which is a weak copy left, and one of which is strong copy left. And we never have to talk about this ever again. You can get on with the important stuff of actually making things, you know, which is probably a pretty stupid thing for a lawyer to say, because I'm making, you know, I want to make myself redundant. I want this job to be done and dusted. These are the changes to the CERN license. I'll sort of bung this provision that I mentioned some of these. The best thing about this is that they've also agreed to put compatibility with Tapper in there as well. So if you choose the CERN license, you are allowed to change it to the Tapper license if you want to, which is supposed to be a stronger license. We have to be happy with the way that Tapper's looking before that happens. But again, you know, the idea is more license compatibility. And there's a few other technical things in there that have simplified it. It will make a lot more sense, you can make a lot more sense of what I'm saying, actually looking at some of the licenses if you really want to, and there's some links there, and as I say, I'll let Andrew have the presentation and you can put it up on the OSHUG website. Right, that's it, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, I think